I locked the bathroom door after I found my husband with my sister. 15 minutes later, their whole future collapsed. My name is Audrey Calloway Mercer. I am 34 years old. At 2014 in the afternoon on a Wednesday in October, I came home early from work because a client meeting had been canceled. I pulled into my garage and saw my sister Brittany's white Porsche Cayenne, parked in the second bay, the bay that had always been mine. I remember standing in the kitchen for a moment, perfectly still. I could hear water running upstairs, and I could hear laughter coming from the master bathroom. I walked up the stairs slowly. I didn't rush, I already knew. I stood outside the bathroom door for exactly 11 seconds. Then I reached into the utility drawer beside the linen cabinet, took out the master lock key I had always kept there, and I locked the door from the outside. Then I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Daniel Rhodes, my sister's husband. I said 4 words: "Come to my house." He heard something in my voice, because he didn't ask a single question. He said, "I am leaving now." The second call was to Victor Hale, my family attorney, and the trustee of my estate. I said, "Victor, it is Audrey. Activate the protocol we discussed," he said. "I will have everything ready within the hour." 14 minutes later, Daniel arrived. He did not come alone. And what my husband Grant, my sister Brittany, and my mother Elaine did not know, what none of them had any idea about, was that by the time anyone in that house said a single word to me, my attorney already had the trust documents, the prenuptial morality clause, and the forensic financial records that would prove, in precise and unambiguous detail, exactly whose life was about to collapse. Before I tell you what happened next, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story genuinely resonates with you. Drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one. Now, let me take you back to where this really began. I was 12 years old the first time I understood clearly what I was to my family. It was the night of my school recital. I had spent 4 months learning a piano piece, a Clementi sonatina. My teacher said showed real discipline for someone my age. My parents came. Brittany came. She was 8. During my performance, not before, not after, but during, Brittany stood up and announced loudly that she needed to use the bathroom and that her stomach hurt. My mother took her out immediately. The audience turned to look. I kept playing. I finished the piece afterward. While my teacher told my parents I had real potential, my mother nodded distractedly and said to Brittany, "You feeling better, sweetheart?" She never mentioned the performance again. When I brought it up 2 days later, my mother looked at me with genuine puzzlement. "Brittany was just excited for you," she said. "You know how sensitive she is." That became the template. At 22, I graduated from the University of Washington, with honors, and a full scholarship to a forensic accounting program. It was the first time in my family that anyone had received a full academic scholarship. I announced it at dinner. My father nodded. My mother smiled. Then she turned to Brittany, who had just failed her sophomore year at a community college, and said, "Brittany, honey, we need to figure out your situation. The tuition is due next month." The conversation moved on. My scholarship was not mentioned again that evening. I sat at that table and I thought, I am the engine. She is the occasion. And I filed that thought somewhere quiet and useful inside myself. I should tell you something about Brittany, because I don't want you to think this story is about hating her. I don't hate her. What I feel, when I am being precise about it, is something closer to a long, exhausted grief. Brittany was not a monster. She was a person who had been raised to believe that the world would make accommodations for her, and that if it didn't, someone nearby would. That someone was almost always me. I covered for her at 17 when she crashed our father's car and didn't want to say how. I lied for her at 20 when she plagiarized a paper, and the school called our parents. I gave her $4,300 in 2018 when her credit cards were overdrawn and she needed to make rent, and I told her she didn't need to pay it back, and she didn't. I did these things not because I was weak, but because I believed stubbornly and against accumulating evidence that one day she would do something for me in return, that the account would balance. That love operated that way. It doesn't. I know that now. At 28, 6 months after my wedding, I began to notice what Grant was doing with my work. I had spent 3 years building a licensing structure for a niche compliance software tool I had developed during graduate school. It wasn't glamorous. It was methodical. By the time Grant and I married, the LLC had 2 active licensing agreements, bringing in $180,000 annually. Grant had his own business, a mid-size operational consulting firm, but his growth had plateaued. Shortly after we married, he began using my professional network to build new client relationships. He began citing my financial credibility in his pitch decks. He began referencing our assets in conversations with investors. When those conversations produced results, he called himself self-made. At family dinners, my mother would say, "Grant is doing so well." She would look at me and add, "You must be so proud of him." I was never credited. I was never even acknowledged. I remember sitting in my car in the parking garage of our building one evening, after a particularly long day, and thinking very clearly, they don't see me as a person. They see me as infrastructure, and infrastructure doesn't get thanked. It just gets used until it fails. That night, I called Victor Hale and told him I wanted to review my trust documents. He said, "I was wondering when you had call. Let me tell you what was actually at risk. Not emotionally, structurally." Over 6 years of marriage, I had quietly become the financial foundation of a life that looked, from the outside, like Grant's success. The house we lived in, a 4-bedroom in Bellevue with a view of the Cascade foothills, sat inside a family trust I had established before the wedding. It was not marital property. It had never been marital property. Grant knew a trust existed. He did not know the precise terms. My LLC held the IP and licensing rights to the compliance tool that had, by the time I came home to find that Porsche in my garage, grown to 3 active licensing agreements, worth $340,000 annually. One of those agreements was a pending Portland deal, $2 million over 3 years, that Grant had been using as the centerpiece of his firm's expansion pitch. He had told his partners, his investors, and his prospective clients that this deal was within reach. What he had told none of them was that the IP authorizing that deal belonged entirely to my LLC. His name was nowhere on it. There was also the prenuptial agreement. We had signed one before the wedding. Grant had reviewed it with his own attorney, a colleague of his, not a specialist in family law, and had signed it at a dinner table in 40 minutes, while we waited for our food. I had spent 6 weeks with Victor drafting the morality clause. It was specific. It was enforceable. It named infidelity as a triggering event that would restructure the asset division significantly in my favor. Grant thought the prenup was a formality. He thought it was what financially cautious people did before weddings. He never treated it as something with teeth. And emotionally, I need to say this, because it matters, the worst part was not the 6 years of being dismissed at family dinners. It was not the 312 times I kept quiet when I should have spoken. The worst part was that I had genuinely believed, somewhere very deep and very stubborn, that if I kept building, if I kept producing, if I kept being indispensable, they would eventually look at me and see me, not my output, not my usefulness, me. I wanted to be known and chosen by the people who were supposed to know and choose me automatically. And I had spent years trying to earn something that was never being withheld, because I hadn't earned it. It was being withheld because giving it to me would have required them to give me something they had decided Brittany needed more. The night before everything broke, I remember sitting at my desk at 11 p.m., running numbers on the Portland deal, and thinking, if one more person tells me I should smile more or be more present, or stop being so intense about work, I am going to update the trust documents. I said it to myself like a joke. 3 weeks earlier, I had actually done it. 3 weeks before I came home to find Brittany's car in my garage, I sat down with Victor and updated my trust documents. I told him I wanted everything airtight. He didn't ask why. He just said, "Good timing." I didn't know then how precise that phrase would turn out to be. The client meeting that was canceled that Wednesday was a 2 p.m. call with a firm in Redmond. They pushed it to the following week. I was already in my car. I thought about going back to the office and decided against it. I drove home. I noticed Brittany's Cayenne before I even pulled into the garage. She hadn't told me she was coming. She hadn't texted. I remember thinking briefly that something must have happened, that she needed something. That was still my first instinct. Even then, to assume that her presence meant she needed something from me. I had been making that assumption for 22 years. I made it once more, automatically, in the driveway of my own house. The water was running in the master bathroom. The laughter stopped when I was halfway up the stairs. There was a moment of silence, the particular silence of people, freezing mid-movement. Then resumed. Lower. 11 seconds at that door. I counted them. I have tried to describe what those 11 seconds felt like, and I find I cannot do it precisely. It was not entirely shock, because I think some part of me had known for some time that something in my marriage had been quietly decomposing. It was not rage, though rage came later in smaller, cleaner bursts. It was something more like clarity. The kind of clarity that only arrives when the last ambiguity is removed. Then I locked it, went downstairs, and made my calls. Daniel arrived 14 minutes later. He brought his brother Marcus, who happened to be a civil attorney doing a standby consult. I had not planned that. That was Daniel's instinct, and I was grateful for it. My mother arrived 7 minutes after Daniel. I did not call her. To this day, I don't know who did. She walked into my kitchen and looked at me the way she had always looked at me when things went wrong, with that particular expression. That meant she was already composing the story she would tell other people. She sat down at my kitchen island and said, "Audrey, where are they?" I said, "Upstairs." She nodded slowly. Then she said the words I will carry with me for the rest of my life. "Men make mistakes." She paused. She folded her hands. "If you were home more often, maybe he wouldn't have looked elsewhere." I looked at her for a long time without speaking. Then I walked to the foot of the stairs, unlocked the bathroom door, and walked back to the kitchen. I did not go in, I simply made it possible for them to come out. They came down together, Grant in a bathrobe, Brittany in her dress, hair wet, holding her shoes. She looked at me and said, "He needed a real woman." The kitchen was very quiet. Grant looked at Daniel, then at Marcus, then at me. He said, "You are really going to destroy everything over one mistake?" I looked at him. I said, "I already haven't." Then I picked up my bag, my laptop case, and my car keys, and I left my own house. 4 years earlier, I had sat in Victor Hale's office on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Seattle, trying to explain something I didn't yet have words for. I told him I felt like everything I had built was sitting on ground that other people treated as theirs. That I kept producing value, that kept being absorbed into a marriage, into a family dynamic, into a business structure, and that I had no real protection if the people absorbing it ever decided they didn't need me anymore, or decided to punish me for being too much or not enough. Victor listened without interrupting. When I was done, he said, "Documentation is what people call cruel when they expected access." He told me to think of legal structure, not as a wall, but as a record of what actually belongs to whom, established before anyone has a reason to dispute it. He told me that the best time to build it was when nothing was wrong. Because when something goes wrong, the person with the clearest documentation is the person with the clearest ground to stand on. I spent the next 8 months restructuring everything: the trust, the LLC, the prenuptial amendment, the IP registrations. Victor drafted the morality clause over 4 sessions, and I reviewed every line. Grant signed the final prenup version with his golf buddy, reviewing it over a lunch that I was not invited to. I remember thinking, he is not taking this seriously. And I remember thinking, that is his choice to make. The Portland deal had been Grant's idea, but it required my LLC's licensing rights to execute. He had mentioned it to his partners, as though it were already within his control. He had never, in 2 years of building toward it, asked me directly whether I would authorize it. He had always assumed. What none of them understood, not Grant, not Brittany, not my mother, was that the house had never been in Grant's name. The deal had never been in Grant's hands. And the moment he made his choice in that bathroom, the clock started. I had just left the room. I checked into the Four Seasons in Bellevue that night. Room 714. I ordered coffee, opened my laptop, and did not cry. I want to be honest about that. I wanted to cry. There was something in my chest that felt like a structural failure, like a beam giving way slowly. Not all at once, 6 years. A house I had loved, a marriage I had tried to be present in, even as I was being told, in 100 quiet ways, that my presence was insufficient. But I had learned, somewhere in the years of recitals, and scholarship dinners, and parking garage realizations, how to hold the grief and still move. So I held it and I moved. At 9:47 p.m., Victor called. He confirmed the morality clause was triggered. The language was specific, and the documentation I had given him text records. Home security camera logs from that afternoon. Daniel Rhodes as a first-hand witness was sufficient to proceed. He said separation could be filed within 48 hours. I told him to proceed. At 10:15 p.m., I called Nora Bennett, the compliance officer who managed the licensing agreements under my LLC. I asked her to formally document that the Portland deal authorization had never been transferred to Grant's firm, and that no such transfer was pending. She confirmed it. She sent me the written certification within the hour. She asked if I was okay. I said I was working on it. At 11:30 p.m., Daniel Rhodes called. He had questions about that afternoon, about what he had seen, about what it meant. And then he told me something I had not known. Brittany had done something similar before 2 years earlier, with a colleague of his at a firm event. He had let it go. He had told himself it was a one-time collapse in judgment. He had never told me. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Then I said, "I am sorry, Daniel." He said, "I filed this morning." I hadn't known that either. He had called his own attorney before he called me back. He had been building his own documentation too. We stayed on the phone for a few more minutes without saying much. Then we both hung up. I sat at the desk in room 714 and looked at the city lights for a long time. I had walked into that day expecting a canceled meeting and a quiet afternoon. I was leaving it with a separation filing, a triggered prenup clause, a certified IP document, and the clear, cold knowledge that I had been right to build every single structure I had ever been told was excessive. I thought about the years of being called too guarded, too transactional, too focused on logistics when I should have been focused on feeling. I had been told, in various forms by various people I loved, that the way I moved through the world carefully, documented, structured was a symptom of something broken in me, that people who trusted fully didn't build trust documents, that people who loved didn't need morality clauses. I had heard this, and I had doubted myself. And I had still, quietly, kept building, because I had learned very early that the people who told me structure was unloving were always, without exception, the people who would benefit from my having none. I didn't plan a confrontation, I planned an exit. But there was one more scene to get through first. 12 days after I locked that bathroom door, my mother called me. She said she wanted us all to sit down together. She said it was important to handle this as a family. She said there were things that needed to be talked through before anyone made irreversible decisions. Her voice had that particular tone she used when she was managing something calm on the surface and very busy underneath. I said I would come. I want to be transparent about why. Not because I needed closure, not because I thought it would change anything. I went because I understood that Grant still believed he had leverage. He had told his partners the Portland deal was close. He had told his friends the separation was a rough patch. He was still operating as though the story was his to control. I thought it was fair to everyone in that room to let them see what the actual situation was. The dinner was at my mother's house in Mercer Island. 12 people. My parents, Grant, Brittany, and apparently Daniel, who showed up at the same time I did. 3 of Grant's relatives. 2 family friends my mother had included, I assume as social ballast. And then 2 people who had not been invited. Victor Hale arrived at 6:52 p.m., 8 minutes into the meal, with Nora Bennett beside him. My mother looked up from the head of the table and said, "Who are these people?" I said. "Victor is my attorney. Nora manages my LLC. They are here because this conversation involves both areas." Grant's expression shifted just slightly. But I had been watching his face for 6 years, and I knew that shift. It was the first moment he understood something had moved. Victor set 3 document folders on the dining table. He did not sit down, he said. Mrs. Calloway, I apologize for the interruption. This will take about 10 minutes. He opened the first folder. The trust structure. The house in Bellevue, its ownership, the terms, the conditions under which it could be sold or transferred. He explained it clearly, without editorializing. Grant stared at the document. He said, "What is this?" Victor said. "This is what you signed 6 years ago, and what has always been true." He opened the second folder, the prenuptial morality clause. He read 3 sentences aloud. The room was very quiet. Grant's face went the color of the white tablecloth. He said, "You cannot enforce," Victor said. "It has already been filed." Nora opened the third folder. She addressed Grant's business partner directly, a man named Roland, who had driven up from Tacoma, and who had, for 2 years, believed the Portland deal was within Grant's authority to deliver. She confirmed, with documentation, that the IP authorizing the Portland licensing agreement belonged entirely to my LLC, that no transfer of authorization had occurred, or was pending, that the deal, as Grant had presented it, could not close. Roland set down his fork. My mother stood up. She said, "This is not the time or the place." I looked at her. I said, "You chose this outcome the day you told me it was my fault." She sat back down. Brittany had not spoken since I arrived. She was sitting across the table from Daniel, not looking at him. At some point during Victor's presentation, she began crying quietly. The way she had always cried, carefully, so people would notice. She said, "I don't understand why you have to do it like this." Daniel stood up. He looked at Brittany for a moment. Then he said, quietly but clearly, "Brittany, I filed this morning." She looked at him. Her face did something complicated, and then she looked at me, and for a moment, just a moment, I saw something behind her eyes that wasn't the performance. It was shock. Real, plain shock, because she had, I think, genuinely believed that I would fall apart, that I would yell or cry or make accusations in a shaking voice while she stood composed. She had prepared for that version of me, the version that needed permission, the version that still wanted to be chosen. I was not that version anymore. I stood up. I did not look at Grant. I looked at the center of the table, at nothing in particular, and I said, "To the room, I am not angry. I am just done." Then I walked to the door, picked up my coat, and left. The separation was filed the next morning. The morality clause was formally activated, which restructured the asset division in precise accordance with what we had signed. The house went into trust liquidation proceedings. Grant had 30 days to arrange alternative housing. The Portland deal collapsed within a week. Roland sent a brief email to Grant's firm withdrawing his participation, citing unresolved structural concerns. Grant's 2 other business partners began quietly distancing themselves. I heard through a mutual contact that Grant had told them the deal fell through, due to complications on Audrey's side. I didn't correct that. The documents had already done the correcting. Grant called 11 times over 3 days. I did not answer. On the 4th day, he sent a text that read, "We can work this out. I made a mistake. You are destroying our life." I read it once. I archived it. I did not reply. Brittany sent me a message that was 840 words long. I counted them. It moved through several stages: regret, explanation, appeal to sisterhood, a pivot to her own pain, a final request that I consider what this is doing to Mom. I read it in full. Once I archived it beside Grant's texts. I did not reply. My mother called on a Sunday afternoon. She said, "You are destroying this family." Her voice was sharp and certain, the way it always was when she was most afraid. I said, "I didn't build this, Mom. I just stopped maintaining it." She hung up. I sat in my hotel room, and I felt something I had not expected. Not relief, not triumph, not vindication. Something quieter. Something that felt, for the first time in a long time, like the absence of weight. 3 months after that Wednesday afternoon, Grant hired 2 family law attorneys to challenge the trust structure. Victor had anticipated this. The challenge did not succeed. The documentation was, as Victor had always said it would be, precise and unambiguous. The process cost Grant approximately $34,000 in legal fees. To cover those fees and his new rent, he sold a condo he owned on Capitol Hill, a property he had always referred to as his safety net. I want to dwell on that for a moment, not out of satisfaction, but because it matters to the story. Grant had spent 6 years living in a house that was not his, building a business expansion on IP he did not own, and operating under the assumption that the structures around him were shared and permanent. He had never looked carefully at what any of it actually said. He had assumed access. He had never verified ownership. And when the structures were removed, he discovered he had been building on someone else's ground the entire time. That is not a metaphor. That is what the documents showed. 4 months after the dinner at my mother's house, the Portland deal was officially dead. Roland had moved to a competing firm and taken the project with him. Grant's consulting firm lost 2 more clients in the following quarter, clients who had been connected to me through my professional network and who quietly declined to renew. I did not engineer this. I simply stopped being the bridge. In November, 5 months after everything began, I learned through Daniel that Brittany had moved back into my mother's house. Their divorce was proceeding. Brittany had told several people in her social circle that she was the real victim in all of this, that she had been manipulated, that Grant had pursued her, that she had been in a vulnerable place. I heard this secondhand and I felt nothing particular about it. People tell the stories they need to tell. The documents remain the same regardless. What I did not expect, what genuinely surprised me, came from a woman named Carol, my father's older sister, who I had not spoken to in 3 years. She called me in December and said she had heard what happened. She said she had watched my family dynamics for a long time, and had always felt something was wrong but had never known how to say it. She said, "I always knew you were the one holding things together. I just never thought you would put it down." I told her I appreciated the call. She said, "How are you actually doing?" And I told her the truth. That I was in therapy, that I was going every Tuesday afternoon to see a woman named Dr. Claire Simmons in an office in Kirkland, with a window that faced a small courtyard with a Japanese maple in the center. That in our 3rd session I had cried for the first time, not about Grant, not about Brittany, but about something older and quieter, about a 12-year-old who finished her piano piece while her mother took her sister to the bathroom. About the part of me that had spent 22 years trying to be indispensable enough to be seen. About the way I had learned to make myself useful before anyone could decide I was unnecessary, and the cost of living that way, compounded, over years, in the body and in the quiet places behind the eyes. Carol listened to all of it. She didn't offer advice or comparisons, or the particular brand of family mythology that usually gets deployed in these conversations to soften the truth into something more manageable. She just listened. It was, I realized afterward, the first time someone in my family had done that, without also, somewhere in the listening, calculating how the information could be used later. Dr. Simmons had said to me, in our 5th session, "You built a fortress to protect yourself from people who were supposed to protect you. That is not a character flaw. That is a survival response. The work now is learning, you don't have to live in a fortress just because you built one." I think about that often. 6 months after that Wednesday in October, I signed a new licensing agreement with a compliance firm in Chicago. 3-year term, $890,000. The LLC was growing in ways I had not fully anticipated when I first built it. In January, I moved into a new apartment on the 11th floor of a building in Capitol Hill, the same neighborhood where Grant had sold his condo to pay his attorneys. The apartment has a view of Lake Washington on clear mornings. I have a kitchen I use. I have a desk by the window where I work in the evenings. My mother and I have not spoken since November. I do not know if that will change. I hold that question carefully, the way you hold something that is still warm but might break if you grip it too tightly. What I know is that I am not waiting. I am not leaving a door open in hope. If something changes, it will change because she changes, not because I made myself smaller again to make it easier for her. Brittany and I have not spoken. I don't expect that we will. Daniel and I exchanged a few messages over the winter. He is doing okay. He has a new apartment in Bellevue and a dog named Henry. He said once, in a short message, "Thank you for being the one who locked the door." I understood what he meant. It is 7:03 in the morning as I sit here now. My coffee is in the white mug I bought at a market in Pike Place on a Saturday in February when I walked for 2 hours by myself and didn't explain myself to anyone. The light is coming through the window at a low angle and landing on the corner of my desk. Outside, the lake is flat and pale and very quiet. A ferry is crossing in the distance, slow, deliberate, exactly on schedule. I find I like mornings like this one. Mornings with no performance required, no managed tone, no careful silences, no reading of the room before I speak. I spent a long time learning how to exist in rooms that required that kind of vigilance. I am slowly learning how to exist without it. I am not who I was the day I stood in that hallway and counted 11 seconds. I am something quieter and something harder, not in the sense of cold, but in the sense of solid. The way a thing gets harder when it has been tested and held. Here's what I have learned. And I want to say it carefully, because I don't think it is simple. You don't have to be cold to have structure. You just have to stop pretending that structure is cruelty. For years, I was told in words and in silence, and in the way people looked through me at my sister, that wanting clear terms, wanting ownership of what I built, wanting to be acknowledged, rather than just used, was somehow a character deficiency. That the emotionally generous thing was to share without conditions, give without records, love without contracts. What I understand now is that this was never about generosity, it was about access. The people who told me that structure was unloving were the people who needed me to have none. Here is the second thing. The people who call you too much are often the people benefiting from how much you give. I was told I was too focused on work, too serious, too unavailable, too ambitious. I worked 16-hour days to build things that other people treated as their birthright. I was too much, and I was also, mysteriously, never quite enough. I want you to sit with that contradiction for a moment, because if you recognize it, you already know what it means. And here is the last thing. The one I think is most important. Leaving isn't destruction. It is just the end of your maintenance contract. I did not destroy my marriage. I did not destroy my family. I withdrew my labor from a structure that had been taking it without acknowledgement for years. What collapsed was not something I built. What collapsed was the illusion that they had built it. And there is a difference, a significant, important difference between grief and guilt. I felt both. I still feel both in different proportions on different days. But I no longer confuse them. Grief says, something real is gone, and you are allowed to mourn it. Guilt says, you caused this, and you owe them repair. I grieved. I did not repair. Because the thing that needed repairing was not something I had broken. If you are watching this, and you have been the one holding everything together, managing the crises, smoothing the conflicts, making yourself smaller, so others could feel larger. And if someone in your life has recently told you that you are the problem, that you are too cold, too serious, too unavailable, too much. I want you to hear this carefully, and I want you to hear it without the softening that gets added to these things when people are afraid of how much it costs to say them plainly. You are not the infrastructure. You are the architect. And architects get to choose what they build next. They get to choose the site, the materials, the purpose, and most importantly, who is allowed inside. You don't need their permission to leave. You don't need their acknowledgement to know what you did. The documents exist. The record is clear. And the next structure you build, the one on ground that actually belongs to you, will stand, because you built it right. And because this time, you are building it only for yourself. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it resonated, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever been the person in your family who held everything together? And if you were, what was the moment you realized it wasn't being seen? Tell me your story. I read everyone. Check the description for more stories like this one. Until next time, build carefully. Build on ground that is yours. And know when to lock the door.